Alright, so mistake number one is buying really exceedingly cheap parts. Like this little thing down here. You can see there's a hose that comes off of it down there, and another one over here that goes over here to my coolant tank. So this is what's called a thermostat. What this does is this regulates temperature inside the engine. Alright, and if it's too hot, that's really bad for your engine, and if it's too cold, it's not as bad, but it's kind of bad for your fuel consumption, because when an engine is cold, it uses more fuel than when it's hot. Or rather, when it's at operating temperature, which for most cars is around 90 to 95 degrees Celsius, or around 200-ish degrees Fahrenheit. So I got a really cheap one, and what happened with that is it would, basically there's a little sort of flap in here that, and a spring, little flap on a spring, and when the spring gets hot enough, it becomes malleable enough to be pushed back by the coolant that goes through the engine. And once it's hot enough to be pushed back, it lets some of the coolant from the radiator up here into the engine and cools it down. But mine was leaking through that flap all the time, so the engine never really got a chance to get to its normal temperature. It would always be too cold. And that's because I just bought a really cheap part. So I went online and I looked around, did my research, and found that most people recommend buying the genuine, or at least the original manufacturer of the part, because even though cars are made by a certain manufacturer, that doesn't mean all the parts in it are made by that manufacturer. Like, for example, very clearly over here, this, which is part of my emission system, I'm not going to go into what exactly this is made by a company called Pierburg, which isn't BMW. And this thermostat down here is made by a company called Voller. But I just bought a really cheap one because I didn't want to spend all that much money on it, hoping it would last a while, but it didn't even last a month for me. So that's one of the mistakes, using cheap parts. Another mistake I made is my rear suspension. I bought really cheap shocks and springs, which broke. So recently I had to replace the rear suspension with better parts. So hopefully those will last longer this time. But another common mistake is a lot of cars are held together with little plastic clips and things like that, like these little things here. Just bring another one over here. These little things. I broke one of them on this particular piece, which is part of my intake system. Air comes in under the radiator, under here, goes up through here, and then to my air filter, and then down there into the engine. And I broke one of the little clips here that holds that on. But a lot of these little clips, you can substitute a zip tie most of the time. If there isn't a way to get a zip tie all the way around, because there's no way to get part of it out, because obviously with a zip tie you have to loop around something, you can always, if need be, drill a small hole into whatever piece you're using. Most of the time you'll be able to do that without changing the functionality. Another thing that I broke, this is my radiator fan here. This, when the radiator gets too hot, blows air, or pulls air through the radiator to cool it. And I don't know if you can see it over here, there's a screw here. This side is held on, or was held on, by a plastic clip, which I broke because it's plastic and it's been experiencing a lot of temperature changes over the past more than a decade. So it just sort of fell apart when I took this out. So again, that's got a zip tie on it. Same in the middle here, zip tie on that. And it holds itself in. Well, the little bit of a shifting that it does do isn't really enough to change anything, because this fan is electric. So it's just powered by some wires, and a little bit of movement about doesn't really change anything. So that's one of the more common mistakes, cheap parts and breaking some fasteners. Occasionally you might have to deal with a broken or stripped bolt. So if we go down here, this is going to be difficult to see. I'm actually going to go get a flashlight. Okay, now that I have a flashlight, hopefully you're able to see. Let me just get a little bit closer here. This, I'm going to set up the flashlight so you can see. This bolt right here, and the bit above it, as you can see. This is what's called a subframe mount. So this holds the front part of the frame, because nowadays cars are usually two separate bits of frame held together by the body. In the middle, it's called a unibody. So part of the bit that holds up the front part of the frame, I had to take the front part of the frame down to do some work. I was replacing my oil pan gasket, which is the oil pan holds all your oil, and the gasket is what connects it to the rest of the engine, or rather, what sits in between the connection point to prevent stuff from leaking out. And while putting it back on, I put it on way too tight, and I sheared the head off the bolt, so it didn't stay connected. But luckily, again, most things are replaceable. So I went down to my local junkyard and I got a replacement piece. Now, a fair warning about junkyard parts, they're not ideal for all situations, but they are great for some situations. Like things that don't typically break or don't typically experience much wear at all can be really beneficial to get it from the junkyard. Like that little piece cost me about $20 from a junkyard. If I were to buy it brand new, it would be almost $100. So, and it's been in there for over 2 years now, no issues. So sometimes junkyard parts are nice. Like if this ever broke, I could probably replace this with a junkyard part. These bolts, like bolts and things like that, are something good you'd get from a junkyard. Like your washer fluid tank, you'd get that from a junkyard. Another headlight if yours broke. Just random trim pieces and panels, caps like for the oil, the power steering fluid, and the coolant. Those are great things to get from a junkyard. Yeah, junkyard parts are great if you just need one simple thing. Like you don't want to get something really complex from a junkyard. Like you don't want to get a junkyard. Actually, junkyard radiator can sometimes be a good idea. If yours is leaking, sometimes a replacement from a junkyard, while not ideal, won't work as well as a brand new radiator. It will certainly solve the problem you're having. But things like sensors, a lot of electronic components are things you don't want to get from the junkyard, like this, which is an ABS pump control. It controls the anti-lock brakes. You don't want to get that from a junkyard. You don't want to get your brake master cylinder, which is what provides you with power brakes, from a junkyard. You don't want to get a new cylinder head. You might want to get from a junkyard, but complex things, like sensors and complex electrical things, are not things you want to buy from a junkyard. Just don't. Sometimes you just need to bite the bullet. But bolts, simple mounts, simple tanks, and other basically just simple things are usually a good bet to get from a junkyard. Other things I've gotten from the junkyard, these little caps that go in the middle of the wheels. I lost a couple of those because I broke them. What else do I have from the junkyard? Like these valve cover stems, got those for like 10 cents each from the junkyard. New clips to hold this in. Yeah, so a lot of the times what you break can be, you can just get it replaced or replace it with something from a junkyard. And even if the issue's more complex, with cars, there really isn't anything that can't be fixed. So, yeah, that's the end of this video.